Hello and welcome to this video tutorial from blendercookie.com. My name is Bartek Skorupa and this is round 3 of our series about compositing in Blender. Today we are going to play a little bit with the scene that you are seeing right now. It was created by Mike Penn and you can download it from blendswap.com. Mike created this using Blender 2.57 and I am working in Blender 2.61, and I noticed that if I simply open this file in Blender 2.61, I may encounter some problems. But let's not think about it at the moment. Let's see what happens if we simply open this file and hit F12. As you can see, Mike did a little bit of compositing here, and you will notice that he didn't use any render passes, but simply worked on the image as a whole. So he simply added several effects to enhance the render a little bit. So when we render this, we got this image. And what can I say? It's simply fantastic. We don't have to do anything with this image, and if I begin to play with this, I'm not really sure if I can achieve this kind of quality. But let's say that our goal is not to make this result better, but we want to learn something. Okay, first let's analyze what Mike did here, and then I will split this image into render layers and render passes and combine them together myself. The first thing that you will notice is that he used ID mask. He indexed one of the objects, and this object is the cover of this lamp. And in order to turn the lamps on, the first thing he did was to brighten the image substantially. But he wanted to brighten only the lamps, so he used the ID mask as the factor for the mix node with the multiply blending mode. And he simply took the original image, multiplied it by the same image but a lot brighter, and used this mask as the factor. Then here he used the defocus node. So we have the camera depth of field. You will see that here in this area our image is a little bit blurred out. Then he used the glare effect, and this kind of turns the lights on. Let's mute this to see the difference. As you can see, this effect is very subtle, and this is the general rule that we should follow. Our effects should be subtle. Okay, then this node, this is not the node, this is the node group. This node group creates a vignette. Let's see how it looks like without the vignette. So I will simply set the factor of this multiply node to 0. So this is without the vignette and this is with the vignette. And this is the node group. Let's take a closer look at it. I will simply duplicate it. Now I will hit Tab, and you will see that several nodes are grouped together. When I hit Tab, I can edit this group, but let's first create the group of our own, so that you know what I'm talking about. I will hit Alt-G to ungroup those nodes, so now they are just the regular nodes. And if you want to create the group from the nodes, you simply select them and then hit Ctrl-G. And we got a group. But we have no input, no output. Let's hit Tab, and now we can edit this group. So let's say that we want something to go here into the group and be connected to this socket. So I simply select this socket and grab it here. And now I have the input of the group. I can have several inputs. I can make an input of this one, for example, or delete it by hitting this little cross. And I will connect the output of this one here, so I have the output of the group. Let's, in this group, for example, duplicate this node. I will not connect it anywhere. I simply wanted to show you the idea of the group. Let's call this group something, like my group, hit Tab to collapse it, and let's delete it. And we can reuse the groups. We simply hit Shift-A, group, and as you can see, I have my group. I can select it, and it appears as a node. Okay, so here we have the group that creates the vignette, and this solution is very popular. It's very often used by Andrew Price. If you want to know more about this solution, simply watch some of Andrew's tutorials. Okay, so here we have the vignette. Then Mike applied the color balance effect. And here at the end we have the brightness and contrast node, but it doesn't do anything. Brightness and contrast are set to 0, but we can set those values to something else and simply change our image. Okay, there is one thing that I noticed. Mike didn't use the color management. Let's turn the color management on and see what happens. Nothing changed, but let's re-render this. And that's the result. So what does the color management do? It makes our image bright and ugly. Well, this is not exactly true. The concept of color management is to force Blender to work in linear color space. And I will not explain it in details, because it would make my tutorial few hours long. I will only explain the general idea of this. When we are looking at any image on our computer screen or in television, the color values don't represent the light intensity. If the light intensities were directly displayed on the screen, we would not see the real colors. And this is because of the way that screens are constructed. So the image is changed before it goes to the screen. And what we see as the values of the colors are not the light intensities, but those changed values. And if we don't work with the color management turned on, we are performing all of the operations on the colors using those changed colors. But we are trying to mimic the behavior of the light. So if we, for example, multiply the intensity of some light by 2, we would like to have our image twice as bright. And this is what happens when color management is turned on. If it's turned off, it gives us the math where 2 plus 2 equals 10. And I hope that everybody knows that 2 plus 2 is 4. So that's just the general idea. Let us simply turn the color management on, and this is what I did here. But in this scene, the lights, the materials, and all of the other settings are not prepared to use color management. So if I want to use color management, I simply have to change those settings. Change the colors, change the lights intensities, and so on. So I appended this scene to new blend file, turned the color management on, activated the render layers, render passes, separated the objects using ID masks, and also used some other methods of separating the objects, and then combined it all together. So let me now show you the file that I modified. So I changed everything that needed to be changed to compensate the color management, separated the image into several components, combined them together, and reapplied the effects that Mike used, but I needed to modify them also to compensate for color management, and that's the result. So those nodes are the effects applied to the combined image, to my combined image that goes from here. And the idea here is almost exactly the same as in Mike's file. And the real fun begins before this image is created, but I don't want to show it to you yet, not to scare you too much. First, let me show you what I can do. So let's change the car paint color. Let's change it to this color. And here you go. Let's change it to another color. And I don't re-render anything. Now, when the car has this color, this background doesn't match. So let's change the color of this background. This one looks a little bit nicer. So now let me show you the setup. And before you get too much scared, please simply believe me that after watching the series, the whole series, you will no longer perceive such setups complicated. Okay, so let's take a look. As you can see, I have placed few nodes here. And the general idea is to have several components and then simply combine them together. So here, this group of nodes are responsible for the background. So when I want to change the color of the background, I change this node only. Those nodes combine together the passes for the car as a whole. Here I have the nodes that are responsible for the car paint, for the body of the car. Then I add the glass, I add the windows, I add the covers of the lamps and so on. And I combine it all together, and the result goes from here to here and goes up. And here it is. And those are the nodes that make the final color grading, defocus, glare, vignette, and that's what I get. So let's begin our game. We will begin from combining all of the passes together to recreate the image that Blender gives us. But this scene is a little bit too complicated, and some of the ideas that I wanted to show you simply don't work here. So I will start with much simpler scene where I will explain the concept, and then we will come back to this one and I will explain what's going on here. And believe me, if you understand what I am talking about using this simpler scene, this setup won't seem so complicated any longer. Okay, so let's start. So that's the scene and this is the render result. I have activated all of the possible passes. From round 2, we know how to mix together all of the passes, but we didn't mix in the refraction pass, the indirect lighting pass, and the environment lighting pass. Let's change this window to UV image editor, and here we have the render result. And let's now recreate this by mixing the passes. So first let's create the setup. Let's add a color mix node. This will be for mixing diffuse with the shadows. So let's change the blending mode to multiply and plug the diffuse pass here. And now I want to set this node such that when nothing is connected here, the output result is exactly the same as the input. When we use the multiply blending mode, we get exactly this, because this color is set to pure white by default. And pure white is 1 for each channel. So when we multiply anything by 1, it doesn't change the value. So multiplying by white color doesn't change the image. Okay, so this one will be for shadows. Let's duplicate it. And this one will be for ambient occlusion. And now let's create the nodes for adding the lighting passes. Let's duplicate this guy, change the blending mode to add, and we will need 6 mix nodes with add blending mode. But I would like the behavior of this guy to be exactly the same as this one. So when I plug something to the upper node and don't connect anything to the lower node, the result should not change the image. But now, when I add white, it will change the image. Let's set those values to 0, so I will simply change the color to black. When I add 0 to anything, it doesn't change the result. Okay, so I need 6 of those. Let's move those guys somewhere here, select all of those nodes, and hit F, and this way everything is connected. Let's now take a look at the result of this one. Control-Shift-Click. This is exactly the same as the diffuse pass, because the diffuse pass goes into the first mix node and it's multiplied by 1. Here the result is multiplied by 1 and 0 is added in all of those nodes. Okay, so we start with the shading passes. Let's get the shadows and plug it here, then ambient occlusion here, and let's add all of the lighting passes. So specular, emit, and reflect. Refraction is easy because we simply add it, but we have a little bit more complicated situation with the environment lighting and indirect lighting. We cannot simply add them. Indirect lighting pass and environment lighting pass need to be modified before they are added. We will modify this by the same image. Let's create this image. I will take the multiply node, duplicate it, and here we will need to create the color multiply by its intensity. Let's plug the color here and take a look at it. We have to multiply it by the intensity. When I take a look at any of the materials, the intensity I am talking about is this one. But in my scene, when I look through the materials, I can say that the average intensity is something about 0.5 or 0.6. So I will expand this node. Let's change the color here to be 0.5. So this is the color pass alone, and this is the color pass multiplied by the average intensity. And now let's take the indirect lighting pass and environment lighting pass and multiply them by this image. So I will take another multiply node, and I will simply take the indirect lighting pass, plug it here, multiply by this one. Now let's duplicate this guy and take the environment lighting and multiply by this one. And now let's plug this one here and this one here. And we are close, but those are not exactly the same images. This is the modified indirect lighting pass. We have to set the proper factor here. So let's take a look at the world settings indirect lighting factor is set to 2. So let's set it to 2 here. This is 2. And the environment lighting energy is set to 0.5. So let's set the value here to 0.5. And it's almost exactly the same. Now, we used some average value of the intensity. Let's expand this node. I used the 0.6. And in most cases it works. But sometimes you have big differences between the intensities of the materials in your scene. And if you want to be very precise, it would be good to create the map of the intensities. I have created such map. Let me show you how it looks like, and then I will show you how to create one. I will take the render layer, duplicate it, and change the render layer. I didn't say a word about render layers and so on. I will come back to it just in a few minutes. Bear with me. Let's change this guy from render layer to intensity. Right now I am just showing you the map of the intensity. This is how it looks like. So let's plug this image here instead of using the single color. So I will take this guy, plug it here, and now when I take a look at the result of all of those nodes, I am sure that here I get exactly the same image as here. Let me select all of those nodes, collapse them, H. Let's take this one, H, and let me show you something interesting. Here I can, for example, select those nodes and rotate. Let's hit R, and as you can see, we rotate the nodes. G, we grab them, S, X, 0, so I simply size them down. S, Y, and now, as you can see, I change the positions of them. So this is how we mix all of the passes together to recreate the render result that comes from Blender's render. Let's, for the moment, come back to the intensity map that I told you about. And how did I create it? I used a different render layer for this. Here, when we expand the layers in the render settings, you know that we can activate or deactivate the passes. But this is not everything that we can do here. Here we can see something that is called render layer. There is only one render layer and it's called render layer. We can call it whatever we want, for example, main. And the render layer is the set of the settings of our render, meaning the passes, and here we have some options. Everything that is included in this panel between the word layer till this little line are the settings for this particular render layer. And we can have many render layers. We can add another one just by hitting this plus button. We can call it something like, for example, intensity. And here we can use different settings. We can use different render passes. We can deactivate some of the options here. And if we have more than one render layer, all of the settings for all of the render layers will be rendered when we hit F12, and we will have the access to them. For example, let's maybe change this window to 3D view. And here you can see that my objects are distributed in many layers. Here I set that only the objects that are located in layer number 1 and layer number 11 should be rendered, no matter how many layers are activated here. So as you can see, scene here, those set of layers reflect those set of layers. This is exactly the same. I can activate or deactivate layers here or do it here. It doesn't matter. And now this render layer that is called main will render only the objects from those layers. And here we have another set of layers, and they are called mask layers. So let's say that for this render layer I will activate the second layer here. What does it mean? Let's say that in layer number 2 we have some object here at the front. This object located in layer number 2 will serve us as a mask. It will simply cover the objects from those layers. Now here, material and light. Let's click the material, and as you can see we have many materials in our scene. we can choose one of the materials, and this will mean that all of the materials will be changed to this one. So no matter what we set as the material for individual objects, it will simply be replaced by this material. Let's delete it. And here, light. We can group our lamps. Right now we don't have any lamps, but let's maybe create the group of lamps. Let's select this layer, let's select those two lamps and hit Ctrl G, T, and right now this group is called group. So now if we select this group from this menu, it will mean that only those lamps will illuminate our scene. All of the other lamps will be ignored. Okay, so how did I create the intensity map? So what I did was simply to select all of those objects, duplicate them, and move them to another layer. I moved them to the layer number 3. So now in layer number 1 I have the original objects, and in layer number 3 I have their copies. And here in the intensity I want only those copies to be rendered, so I activate the layer number 3 here, and now I have to change the materials of those objects. I create the copy of this material, so I simply hit this 2 button, and I have the copy. I can call it whatever I want, like monkey 2, let's say, and I want this material only to reflect the intensity, so I don't have the specular, so I simply set it to 0. I don't have to have the mirror, and this is very important. I don't want this material to be traceable. If the material is traceable, it would mean that this object will not be ignored in this render layer, although it's located in none of those layers. It will be seen by the ray tracer, so it will cast the shadows, it will reflect in other objects. So in this case, this is not what we want, so we deactivate the traceable. We want this material to show us the intensity. So first of all, let's make this material shadeless, and the intensity is set to 0.5. So let's simply set the color to be 0.5 in every channel. 0.5 here, 0.5 here, and here. And that's it. And I will simply do it for every single material. Okay, let's open the file where I have this all set up. And here in this file, everything is organized. So here I have the render layer, and it's the one that I called main. And here I have some other render layers, and this layer that I am talking about right now is called intensity, and it renders only the objects from the third layer. Those layers are activated, and the materials for the objects, for the copies of this object, is set the way I showed you just a second ago. And because I have many render layers, I have the access to all of the passes from all of those render layers. And I do it here in the compositor. So when I simply take the render layer input node, I can duplicate it. And as you can see here, this guy now uses the render layer intensity, and I can choose whatever render layer I want. If I select this one, I have the access to the render passes that are set for this render layer. I can choose another one, and that's the way I access the passes from individual render layers. So here I did exactly this. I simply copied the render layer main, changed this guy from main to intensity, and here I can take the color pass of this one, or even the image, because they are exactly the same, because all of the materials here are set to be shadeless. Okay, so this is the setup that we get right now. Using this setup, we are able to control our individual passes, and that's great, but this is still not enough for me. So the question, my scene is lit using the 3 lamps. Very simple setup. And the question is, would it be possible to control the energy of those lamps using the nodes? I would like to be able to control them individually. Or another question, let's take a look at the objects. Would it be possible to change the color of the object exactly the same as I would do it when changing the color of the material in the material settings? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. But this setup is not enough, because we start everything with the diffuse pass. Diffuse pass looks like this. In order to have the level of control I am talking about, we need to get the access to the components that create the diffuse pass. Because right now, the color information is mixed into this image. We have the access to the color information, we simply activate the color pass and we got it. But how to get from color to diffuse? We have to have something that I call energy. Some render engines render the diffuse pass such that the color is not mixed into the diffuse pass. So I would like to have the color, and I have the color, and I would like to have the separate influence of the lamps. Let's try to do something that might seem logical. We could simply take the diffuse and divide it by the color. So then when we take the result of this operation and multiply it by the color, we will get our diffuse back. And that's true. Let's try to do it. I will add a mix node, set the blending mode to divide, take the diffuse, and let's divide the diffuse by the color, and we get this. So let's now multiply this by the color. So I will duplicate this node, change the blending mode to multiply, and I will take the color and multiply it by this one. And when I take a look at it, you see that I get exactly the diffuse pass. So theoretically, this is my energy and this is my color. So I multiply this by this and I get this. And in case of this image, it should work, but unfortunately not always. And I will not show you the examples of the scenarios where it's not working. Please simply believe me. It gives weird results when we use certain colors or certain textures. So in some cases, it would be good simply to create this energy pass completely separately. Let me show you how to do it. In this scene, I have done this and I used the separate render layer for this. I created the render layer that I called Energy All, and I did exactly the same as when creating the intensity pass. I simply created the copies of all of the objects, placed them in separate layer. In this case, I placed them in layer number 2, and I changed the materials of those objects. So let's take a look at the layer number 2. This is the layer number 2. And now let's take a look at the materials. Maybe I will change this window to 3D view. So this is our monkey. Let's take a look at the material. I of course made a copy of the original material, and I want to have the energy. I am interested only in the diffuse settings here. So for this material, I of course deactivated the mirror and all of the settings that don't matter in this case. I am only interested in this section. Originally, this material had some other color, something like this one. And I want to use the color that can be easily replaced by anything I want. The pass that I create will be multiplied by the color. So if we set the color to pure white, 1 for every channel, it will simply give us the energy. So I simply took the copies of all of the objects, placed them in layer number 2, and didn't change the settings here, but I changed the color to pure white. And when I take a look at the render layers, this render layer renders the objects from layer number 2, so those ones, and from layer number 11, and in layer number 11 we have all of our lamps. I have those lamps and they have their colors. So for example, this one has this color, this one has this color, and this is pure white. Now let's take a look at the other render layers. Energy lamp. I also used the objects from layer number 2, so those objects that have the materials with a white color, but here I chose not this layer, but this layer. And in layer number 12, I have just one lamp. And I have purposely set this lamp to be white. I don't want it to have any color. So this is the render layer that will give me the energy of this lamp alone. This render layer will take the lamps from this layer, from layer 13, and this is the layer 13. I have only one lamp here, so this is the energy of this lamp, and this render layer will give me the energy of this lamp. So I have the main render layer where I have everything. Here I have the energy of all of the lamps with their colors. Here I have the energy of one lamp that is set to white, second lamp, third lamp, and here is the render layer for the intensity. And let's now try to play with this. So I will not use those nodes, so let's simply select them and delete them. And we will now be creating our own diffuse pass. So I need the energy and I need to multiply it by the color. I will take the color from the main render layer. Let me duplicate this render layer input node, and I will change this from main to energy all. And let's simply add a mix node, change the blending mode to multiply, and I will take the color and multiply it by the energy. And the energy is the diffuse pass from the render layer that is called energy all. So this is my diffuse pass. And in this setup, diffuse goes to the first socket of this, so I can replace it with this one. When I select this node and shift select this one, I can replace the connection when I hit Ctrl F. Let's take a look at the result. And we get this result, and it's exactly what we wanted. But now, this uses the energy of all of the lamps. But I would like to exchange it to the combination of individual lamps. So let's simply duplicate this render layer input node, and I will change this one from energy all to energy lamp 1. Let's duplicate it twice. Change this one to lamp 2 and this one to lamp 3. And I will add those energies together. So let me simply add a mix node, change the blending mode to add, and I will add this one to this one. Let's duplicate this node and add this one to this one. Let's connect it to the viewer, and this is what I get. And as you can see, it is different from this one because those lamps are white, and the lamps used in this render layer have their colors. But this is not a problem. We have the full control over it. We can set the color of every lamp to whatever we want. So let's change this energy to this energy. So I will simply connect this one here and take a look at the result. It is of course now different from the original result, but we are now creating our own mix, so we begin not to care about the original. So let's maybe take it out of the way. I will change this window to 3D view, and we will only be looking at this result. Okay, I can delete this node, I don't need it anymore. And let's now take a look at the recreated diffuse pass, so this is this one. And let's try to play with this. I will set the color of the monkey to something completely different. So how do I do it? I will use this node, and the color comes from here to here. So let me change the color of the monkey. I didn't mention it, but it should be rather obvious. I used the object index and I used the material index. And now I will make use of them. So let me add the converter ID mask, connect the object index here. Let's take a look at it. When I set this index to 1, I have the alpha channel of the monkey. Let's smooth this, H to collapse it, And now I can take, for example, this node, duplicate it, plug it here. It doesn't want to plug in. Okay, let's take the color pass, and I will use just a mix blending mode, and I will mix the original color with anything I want. Right now I am mixing the color pass with the white color with a factor of 100%, so when I take a look at it, I simply get the pure white image. But when as a factor I use this guy, it will change the color only of the monkey. So I can change it to something else, like maybe this one. And I changed the color of the monkey. And now, what is happening here at the edges? Okay, there are several ways to deal with such problems. First, let's see what happens if we disable the smooth mask. Well, it didn't do any good. Let's smooth it again, and let's try to do something about it. So I will try to use the filter delayed erode, and this node simply shrinks or expands the mask. Let's try to change the distance to something else. Now you see, 1, 2, 3, and this expands the mask. When I set it to some negative value, it will shrink the mask. So let's try to expand it. Let's try to expand it substantially to 3. And it seems, when we look at this image, it seems that everything is okay. But is it really? Let's plug this guy here. This is our diffuse pass. And let's take a look at the result. Well, we got a problem. And the problem begins here. Let's take a look at it. So let's maybe change this distance to something lower, like 2. It is also not good. 1. Well, it didn't solve the problem. So let's delete this node, leaving the connection, Control X, and let's try a different solution. So let me add the filter blur, connect it here. Let's change the type of the blur to fast Gaussian, and let's set some values like 5. Okay, this completely destroyed the image, but this is just a first step. Let me now add the color ramp and try to plug it here and try to play with those sliders. So something like this, something like this, maybe this, and we can play with it until we find something that will satisfy us. Okay, I think that it's good enough. So let's take a look at the setup once again. We get the ID mask, we blur it, and then we set the proper levels using the color ramp. So we have the red monkey. But does it mix into all of the setup? Let's take a look at the final result. And as you can see, we have the problem. And this problem comes from the indirect lighting and environment lighting. We use the color here. We take the original color, multiply it by the intensity, then multiply the indirect lighting pass by that and environment lighting by that, but we changed this color. So if we changed the color, we have to use it here as one of the components of the diffuse pass, but we also need to use the same color here. This is our new color pass. Let's take a look at it. This is our new color pass. So we have to use this, as I said, to create our own diffuse, but we have to use the same one here. So I can select this node, shift select this one, and replace the connection by hitting Control F. Now when I take a look at the result, it's beginning to look a little bit better. So now I can very easily change the color to whatever I want. So I simply take this node, expand it, and I can change this color to this, make it darker, brighter. And depending on the color that I choose, the problems with the alpha may be smaller or greater. but I can always try to adjust this. So maybe I shouldn't use this much of the blur. Let's change it to 4, and maybe I should try to adjust this here. I think that this is better. But okay, did it change everything? Let's take a closer look here. This glass is reflective, and here, this part, this is the reflection of the monkey, and as you can see, it's green. The original material is green, and we changed the color pass, but we didn't change the reflection pass. So as you can see, we cannot change everything, but still, there is a lot of things that we can do. Now, let's change the energy of the lamps. Right now, in this setup, this is not a problem. We can very easily simulate the situation where we have our scene lit only by one lamp. Let's simply change the factors here from 1 to 0, and as you can see, it is as if we turned the lamps off. Let's maybe increase the energy of the backlight, or 0.4, whatever. So let's say that this lamp is our main light, and we can change the color of it. We can simply move it somewhere here, and let's multiply this by some color. So I will add a color mix, plug it here, change the blending mode to multiply. Right now I am multiplying by the white color, so I didn't change anything, but I can push it to whatever color I want, and I can change the factor maybe a little bit higher. Let's now turn the right lamp back on, so I will simply change this factor from 0 to 1, and I can very easily change the color of this lamp to something different, like let's duplicate this node, plug it here, and I would like this lamp to have some bluish tint, so it's not a problem. I can make this factor a little bit higher. So the possibilities here are endless, as you can see. So here is the setup where I combined all of the passes that I showed you together, and the only change that I made is the color of the monkey. So this is the modified color pass. As you can see, this node is red because it's muted. It's just a mixed node with a factor of 0, and I very often use the muted nodes just to reroute those noodles. So this node doesn't do anything, but if I have it here, I know exactly what goes here into this node, because I gave this node some name. Okay, so I have a modified color pass. This is the energy pass, and they are multiplied together to give us the diffuse pass. Then we multiply everything by shadows, then by ambient occlusion, and then we add the lighting passes one by one. And here, when we come to the indirect lighting pass and environment lighting pass, we have to modify them. We create the color multiplied by the intensity, and this is multiplied by the indirect lighting, which goes here, and it's multiplied by the environment lighting, which goes here. And now, this is the modified color pass, and it's created here in those nodes. So those nodes simply create the mask. Here we have the mix node. The original color pass goes into the upper socket, and into the lower socket I have plugged the input RGB. Add input RGB. So this is how it looks like, and I simply set the color that I want my monkey to be. And here I mix the original color pass with this color using the index of the monkey. And this is my modified color pass. Now here I have the energy, and the energy is the combination of energies of all of the lamps. They are separated, and I simply add them together. So here I have the energy of one lamp, second lamp, third lamp. I set the colors of those lamps, and then I add them together, and here it is. Modified color pass goes here to create our own diffuse pass, and it also goes here, so that the indirect lighting pass and environment lighting pass are modified by the changed color. And this setup allows us to change every aspect of our image. but not exactly, because there are passes that cause some problems. And those are the reflection pass and refraction pass. When I was showing you how to change the energy or the color of individual lamps, I was purposely showing it to you using just the diffuse pass without every other pass mixed in. So let me now maybe change the color of the lamp. For example, this right lamp. Let's change the color of it to something completely different, like maybe let's make it green. Let's maybe also lower the opacity of the backlight to 0.5, let's say, and take a look at the behavior of this glass. Nothing weird is happening with this background, with this object and this one, but the glass is a complete disaster. And the main reason is the refraction pass and the combination of it with the reflections. In the next round of this tutorial, I will explain those problems in details and how to solve them. But now, just to prove to you that the problems are caused mainly by the refraction and reflection, I will simply disable those passes here by setting the factors of those nodes to 0. So let's set the reflection to 0, as well as the refraction. And I have also rendered this image without reflections and refractions, and this is how it looks like. So when we are working with this version of the image without reflections and refraction, we have much more options to play with when the individual energies of the lamps are concerned. So now let me change this right lamp's color back to some bluish one, and let me lower the opacity of it by changing the factor of this node, and everything mixes in pretty nicely. I have included this file into the sources of this tutorial, so you can simply download it and play with it, maybe add some effects, maybe change the colors of the speculars, or do whatever you want, just to practice some techniques. So let's now go back to our car scene. Okay, so in this round I will only show you the general idea of this setup that I created, and I will explain the details of it in the next round of this tutorial. And I will also try to place this car in some more interesting environment. So I have separated the objects into several layers and render layers. For example, the background is rendered separately. It's placed in its own layer. Here in layer number 2 and render layer number 2, I have all of the parts of the car except the body of it. I wanted to have the possibility to work individually on the car paint. And I already showed you what problems may be caused by using the ID masks. So to avoid those problems, I decided not to use the ID masks, but separate the parts of the car into the layers and render layers. So here I have the car without the body, and here is the body. The material of it is set to pure white color. So I have the energy pass, in fact, and I have the render layer for it. And I mentioned before that we can have some problems with the reflections, so I decided to create the separate render layer for the reflections of the car paint. And here I decided to use the layer that contains only this part, and I used the material override, and this material gives us the clean reflections. This reflect material is set to black. It has the reflectivity set to 100%. And this setup allows me to avoid many problems with the reflections. And I will come back to explaining the details of the problems and of the solutions in the next round of this tutorial. I have the separate layer and render layer for the windows. Of course, the windows should be transparent, but I didn't set any transparency. I used the alpha of 100%. I take care about the transparency in compositing. I use the normal pass for it, and also some other techniques. And now, during this tutorial, I have explained the idea of the mask layers, and it would be logical to use the mask layers if I render objects separately, so that the objects are aware of the objects placed in another layers. But here, as you can see, I didn't use the mask layers. And that's because I activated, for some of the render layers, I activated this option that is called All Z. When I select All Z, I don't have to turn the mask layers on, because All Z means that all of the layers, except the one that is rendered in this render layer, will be our mask layers. So I can select mask layers individually, or simply select this option All Z, and then I don't have to set anything here. And here I have the separate render layer for lamps covers, and they are placed in separate layer here, and they are also not transparent. I set the transparency in compositing. I use the All Z as well, and you will notice that in many render layers I have activated only some of the render passes, and for some render passes I have deactivated those little cameras. And when this little camera by the specular pass here is deactivated, it means that the specular pass will not be included into the combined pass of this particular render layer. Sometimes I use this option to save some render time, and sometimes when I deactivate some of the render passes, I mean when I exclude them from the combined pass, it's easier for me to mix it with other passes. I have also generated the render layer that I call ZO, and this serves me as the source for the Z pass, which will be necessary to use the defocus node, and I simply decided to have the combined Z buffer of all of the objects that are included into my scene. And now the nodes. Here in this frame I have all of the input render layers, and here goes the main path of the mixing. So I have one node and it simply goes here. Some components are mixed in here in this node, and other components here, and so on and so on. So everything goes from up to down. And here everything is mixed. And then as you can see, I use some muted node just to reroute the nodal. So the image goes from here to this node and then goes up, here, goes here. And here are the nodes that I borrowed from Mike's original file. And now the components. So here I have the render layer for the background. I took some of the passes from this render layer, mixed them together using those nodes, and then the result of this mixing goes here. Then in this area, here I have the render layer for the car without the car body, and I use the render passes for this. I mix them together using those nodes. You can notice that I didn't alter any of the passes, so I could as well simply use the combined pass of it, but I decided to create this setup so that when later I decide to change something, it's easier for me just to cut some connection with some effect. So here it is mixed and it goes here to the main path of the mixing. Then those nodes mix together the passes for the car body. Then I have the covers of the lamps, and as you remember, I didn't use transparency, and the covers of the lamps should be transparent, and I set the transparency here in the nodes. So I simply, when I mix it in, I use a certain factor, and this factor is created here. So I use the alpha channel of this render layer and modify it using the normal. So here I create the color of the lamps cover, and then I add the specular, I add the reflections, and then I do the same for the windows. In most of the cases I follow the rules that I showed you in round 2, meaning that I take the diffuse pass that I create, or the original diffuse pass, then multiply everything by the shading passes and then add the lighting passes. But I broke this rule when creating the background. I decided to first add the environment lighting and then multiply the result by the shading passes. It simply gave me better results, the results that I liked more. And here I say that I first add the environment lighting, and as you will notice, I don't use the environment lighting pass. I created the environment lighting using the ambient occlusion. It is possible in some cases. And now take a look at all of those red nodes. Those are the nodes that do absolutely nothing. They are muted and they simply reroute those noodles. So someone may say that they are useless, but I found that it's simply clearer when I use those nodes. I simply know what goes into the node here. It's easier for me to zoom in here and just to see, okay, so here I have the diffuse. Okay, this is the shadow. And now let's imagine that those nodes are gone. It would be not that easy to determine what image goes here into this node. So this is how the setup looks like when I use those muted nodes, and everything seems very clear. It's easy to determine what is going on here. And let me now try to delete them all, and you will see how messy everything will become. So here is how it looks like without those nodes. and it becomes very messy. Let's also change the noodle curving to the default of 5, and now I think that it's even worse. So you can compare it to this setup and simply choose if you want to use this solution or not. I prefer to use it. So that would be all for this round. This is what I achieved so far. In the next round I will explain the details of all of the setup. I will come back to the issues with the reflection pass and will try to place this car in some more interesting environment. So thank you very much, Bartek Skorupa for BlenderCookie.com. Hope you find this video useful and see you next time.